viewers, and welcome to another installment of our series of the early air racers. Today we're going to talk about the Travel Air Model R, also known as the Mystery Ship. Now, from what I could find online, apparently the Travel Air Mystery Ship was actually designed off-duty by a couple of employees of the Travel Air Company who wanted to make a race plane. And they were eventually able to convince their bosses to make this aircraft and enter it into the race. The bosses are names you're going to recognize: Clyde Cessna, Walter Beech, and Lloyd Stearman, all of which would go on to individual fame. But in the 1920s, they were running the Travel Air Company, and they made quite a few aircraft. They were a very successful airplane maker, making, I believe, 400 aircraft in 1928 alone. But when they got the designs for this airplane that their engineers had put together, again in their own time, they were actually quite impressed. The airplane was extremely well thought out. For example, it had interchangeable wings to have different wings for different kinds of racing. One of the wings was just over 29 feet, the other set of wings was over 30 feet, so one could be optimized for each type of race. Also, as was common in that era, swapping out engines was not terribly difficult, so the airplane started off with 420 horsepower radial. They built the plane in complete secrecy. The first three, I believe, were built in virtual complete secrecy. And when they took it to the Cleveland Air Races, they actually hid it in a hangar, wouldn't let anybody look at it because they had a lot of their own proprietary technology they were trying to protect, so they didn't roll it out till race time. Now, although technically it was the Travel Air Model R, the press dubbed it the Mystery Ship for obvious reasons, and the name stuck, and it adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the airplane to this very day. You have to remember, pretty much everybody was still flying biplanes when this sleek monoplane came out. And between the end of World War I and 1928, the military had been winning all the races, partly because they had excellent pilots like Jimmy Doolittle, but also because they had the fastest airplanes at the time. But that was about to change. In the 1929 National Air Races, what we would later call the Thompson Trophy Race, actually it would be called that in 1930, Doug Davis mopped the floor with everybody, including the United States Army Air Corps' latest P-6 Hawk fighters. It wasn't even close, including the fact that he thought he cut a pylon and had to go back and lap around it. He had an average speed of about 186 miles an hour, but he had one lap that was clocked at about 208 miles an hour, so it wasn't even close. Now, this made the airplane instantly desirable by all of the record-setting pilots. So a lot of pilots or people that were sponsoring some of these pilots went to Travel Air to try and buy some more airplanes. This would include record-setting pilots and world-famous race pilots like Jimmy Hayslip, the irrepressible Pancho Barnes, Paul Mantz, Frank Hawks, and of course, Jimmy Doolittle. Although the airplane had a 420 horsepower radial engine, and they actually experimented with an inline engine, a Monasco, but it didn't really do that much for the airplane, so they went back to radial engines, eventually getting as much as 425 horsepower engines on front. And by some accounts, one of them was even upgraded to 450. Now, only about 6 of these airplanes were made, but they were not made identically. Each one of them had little differences, and one of the airplanes, the last one made, was actually made out of essentially spare parts. So the first 4 aircraft were manufactured for race pilots. Fifth one was actually bought by the Italians, and they based their Beretta 27M fighter plane on it. And they built 16 of those, which were primarily used against the Japanese and China. In fact, AZ Models makes a kit of the, in 1/72nd scale, of the Beretta 27M in Chinese markings. Of course, at this point in aviation history, records were being broken all the time, sometime only weeks after the original had been set. So the Mystery Ship had a fairly short length of time as what you might call the apex predator, although it left an indelible impression. In fact, some people think that it's the airplane that actually truly started the golden age of aviation, or at least of air racing, because it was the first time that a civilian airplane had beaten a military fighter, and handily, I might add. So at this point, the military, which in their defense was operating on some very anemic budgets, was playing catch-up to civilian aircraft. And at this point, this literally sky was the limit. And this is the next 10 years would be when civilian aircraft would start to dominate all of the records, or at least most of them. And the Travel Air is considered by many people to be the plane that really kicked this off. With such high-profile pilots setting all kinds of records in it, of course, it would instantly become a famous airplane. But again, this was short-lived. Although it won the first Thompson Trophy race in 1929, that was the only Thompson it would win. Although Frank Hawks would set a transcontinental speed record in it, but again, of course, that would be fairly short-lived because faster planes would come out. Curtiss Wright wound up buying out Travel Air, and they actually put the 6th Travel Air together out of essentially parts that were left at the factory. And of the 6 that were made, the first one, unfortunately, the prototype that had won the 29 race, was lost in 1931 before the Thompson Trophy race because of a fire. The second one, from what I can gather, it's currently undergoing restoration. By one source, it says it's in the United Kingdom undergoing restoration. I don't know if that's been completed yet or not. The third one sadly crashed. The fourth one is in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The fifth one was the one that went to the Italians. They eventually ran it out and then scrapped it. And then there's the one that was cobbled together out of spare parts. And I'm not really sure. I believe it's in the Beechcraft Museum. And there's been some replicas made. Well, there you have it, guys. The Travel Air Model R mystery ship. The plane that kicked off the golden era of air racing. Model on.